The horse was gone before sunrise. Garrett Hale stood barefoot in the frost-hard dirt outside his shack, staring at the empty corral like it might reappear if he blinked hard enough. The mare, a dappled grey he'd raised from a foal, had been there at midnight when he'd checked the latch. Now there was nothing but hoofprints heading west into the scrub hills, and a gate swinging loose on rusted hinges. He didn't curse, didn't shout. He just turned back inside, pulled on his boots and loaded his rifle. Garrett had been alone for 3 years, not by choice, by circumstance. His wife had died in childbirth along with the baby, and after that the ranch felt too big and too quiet. He sold off the cattle, kept the horse and lived small. He didn't talk to neighbors, didn't ride into town unless he had to. The mare was the only living thing he'd spoken to in months, and now she was gone. He saddled his second horse, a bay gelding with a scarred flank, and rode out as the sun bled orange across the horizon. The tracks were clear, 2 riders, maybe 3, moving fast but careless. They thought no one would follow. They were wrong. By midday, Garrett had closed the distance. He could see dust rising ahead, hear the faint jangle of tack. His hand tightened on the reins. He wasn't a violent man, but he wasn't soft either. Whoever took his horse would answer for it. Then he heard the crying. It wasn't loud, more like a mewling sound, thin and desperate, carried on the wind. Garrett pulled up short, frowning. It came again, high-pitched, helpless, a baby. He spurred the gelding forward, heart hammering now for reasons he didn't understand. The riders had stopped in a shallow ravine up ahead, and when Garrett crested the ridge, he saw them 2 men arguing beside his mare. One was tall and rail-thin, the other stocky with a crooked hat. Neither looked like they belonged anywhere decent, and there, tied to the saddle with fraying rope, was a bundle wrapped in a blanket. The baby was still crying. Garrett raised his rifle and cocked the hammer. Harsh hash, step away from the horse. Both men froze. The tall one turned slowly, hands drifting toward his belt. The stocky one just stared, mouth half open like he'd swallowed a stone. Easy now, the tall one said, voice smooth as oil. We didn't know she was yours. You knew. Garrett's voice was flat. Gate was latched. You cut it. The tall man shrugged. We needed a horse. Didn't figure you'd miss one. I did. The baby's crying grew louder, sharper. Garrett's eyes flicked to the bundle. The blanket was stained and threadbare, and the child's face, what he could see of it, was red and twisted with hunger or fear or both. What's the baby for? Garrett asked. The stocky man shifted his weight. Ain't your concern. It is now. The tall man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We're taking her to family. Out past the border. Her ma died 2 days back. Fever. We're doing right by her. Garrett didn't believe him. Not for a second. The ropes were too tight. The men too twitchy, and the way they looked at the child like cargo, not kin, made his stomach turn. Untie her, Garrett said. Can't do that. Wasn't asking. The tall man's hand dropped to his revolver. Garrett squeezed the trigger halfway, just enough to make the rifle creak. The man froze. You shoot me, the tall one said softly. My partner shoots you. Then the baby dies out here anyway. That what you want? Garrett's jaw tightened. He hadn't fired a gun at a man in years, hadn't wanted to, but the baby was still crying, and something in that sound clawed at a place inside him he'd buried deep. Let me take her, Garrett said. Keep the horse. Just give me the child. The stocky man laughed, a short, bitter bark. You think we stole a horse for fun? She's worth something. The kid too. Garrett's blood went cold. You're selling her. Neither man answered. The wind picked up, scattering dust across the ravine. The baby's cries turned to hiccuping sobs. Garrett lowered the rifle just an inch, enough to look less threatening, enough to make them think he was backing down. Then he kicked the gelding forward and fired into the dirt between them. The stocky man yelped and stumbled back. The tall one cursed and drew his gun, but Garrett was already moving. He swung the rifle like a club, catching the tall man across the jaw. The stocky one bolted, ran straight for the hills without looking back. The tall man hit the ground hard, groaning. Garrett kicked the revolver away, then turned to the mare. The baby had gone quiet. Hash hash. Garrett's hands shook as he untied the ropes. The knots were cruel, tight enough to leave marks on the blanket, tight enough to have hurt. He peeled the fabric back carefully, half afraid of what he'd find. The baby was a girl, maybe 6 months old, maybe less. Her face was pale and streaked with tears, her eyes wide and glassy. She didn't cry when he lifted her. She just stared at him like she'd forgotten how. Easy, Garrett whispered. Easy now. Behind him the tall man groaned and tried to sit up. Garrett didn't turn around. He cradled the baby against his chest, feeling the fragile weight of her, the faint flutter of her heartbeat. She smelled like sweat and dust, and something sour he didn't want to think about. You made a mistake, the tall man rasped. Garrett glanced back. The man was on his knees, blood dripping from his split lip. His eyes were sharp and mean. You don't know who you're messing with, the man continued. There's people expecting her, people who don't take kindly to interference. Then they shouldn't have stolen my horse. They'll come for her, and when they do, they'll burn you down. Garrett didn't answer. He mounted the gelding awkwardly, holding the baby with one arm, and took the mare's reins in his other hand. The tall man was still talking, threats and curses and promises, but Garrett wasn't listening anymore. He rode. By nightfall he was miles away, camped in a dry wash with a small fire and no stars. The baby had cried for an hour straight, then fallen asleep against his shoulder. He didn't have milk, didn't have anything soft to wrap her in. He tore a strip from his own shirt and soaked it in water, let her suck on it until she dozed off again. He should have ridden to town, should have handed her over to the law, or the church, or anyone with more sense than him, but he didn't, because he'd seen the ropes, seen the men, and he knew that if he let her go, she'd end up sold or dead or worse. So he kept riding. 3 days later the riders came. He heard them before he saw them, hoofbeats in the distance, slow and deliberate. Garrett was camped in a box canyon, and there was only one way out. He doused the fire, grabbed the baby, and pressed himself against the rocks. There were 4 of them, maybe 5. They moved like hunters, fanning out across the canyon mouth, rifles drawn. One of them called out, "We know you're in there, cowboy. Send the girl out, and we'll let you walk." Garrett didn't breathe. "We ain't got all day," the voice continued, "and we ain't leaving without her." The baby stirred in his arms. Garrett clamped a hand gently over her mouth, heart hammering. If she cried, they'd find him. If they found him, it was over. The riders waited. Garrett counted seconds, then minutes. Finally one of them dismounted and started walking into the canyon. Hash hash hash. Garrett had 2 choices, run or fight. Running meant leaving the horses. Fighting meant dying. He chose neither. Instead he stepped out from behind the rocks, baby in his arms, and walked straight toward the riders. "Stop right there," one of them barked. Garrett stopped. The baby blinked up at him. Quiet now, her tiny fingers curled around the edge of his collar. "You know what you got there?" the lead rider asked. He was older than the others, gray-bearded and stone-faced. "A child," Garrett said. "A debt," the man corrected. "Her ma owed money, couldn't pay, so we took the kid as collateral. That's business. She's not cargo." The man's expression didn't change. "She is if I say she is." Garrett looked down at the baby. She was watching him with wide, curious eyes, like she didn't understand what was happening, like she trusted him. And maybe that was the moment it broke. Something inside him, he thought had died with his wife and son. He felt it crack open, sharp and raw, and impossibly alive. "I'll pay the debt," Garrett said. The riders exchanged glances. "You got money?" the gray-beard asked. "Some." "How much?" "Enough." It wasn't true. Garrett had maybe $40 to his name, but he said it anyway, because he didn't know what else to say. The gray-beard studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled, cold and humorless. "You know what the debt is?" Garrett shook his head. $200. The number hit like a fist. Garrett's chest tightened. He didn't have that, didn't have half of it. I'll get it, he said. When? I'll work. We leave in an hour. The gray beard interrupted. You got $200 by then. The girl's yours. You don't. We take her. And we take your horses too, for wasting our time. Garrett's mind raced. There was no way, no possible. Then he remembered. The rifle, his father's rifle, custom made, worth more than anything he owned. He'd sworn never to sell it. But he looked at the baby, this tiny helpless thing, who'd been tied to a saddle like chattel, and he knew. Wait here, Garrett said. 20 minutes later, he rode back with the rifle and a handful of silver. He handed it all over without a word. The gray beard inspected the rifle, nodded slowly. This'll do. He turned his horse and rode away. The others followed. Garrett stood alone in the canyon, holding the baby, watching them disappear into the dust. She cooed softly and grabbed his finger. Harsh hash. The town was small, barely a town at all, but it had a church, and the church had a woman named Clara, who asked questions Garrett couldn't answer, and didn't try to. Where's her mother? Clara asked, holding the baby, like she'd done it 1,000 times. Dead, Garrett said. And her father? Don't know. Clara's eyes narrowed. You just found her. Something like that. She didn't press. Maybe she saw the truth in his face. The exhaustion, the desperation, the way he looked at the baby, like she was made of glass. Clara took the child inside, fed her, bathed her, wrapped her in clean cloth. When she came back out, she said, "You planning to keep her?" Garrett hadn't thought that far. He'd only thought about getting her safe. But now, standing in the churchyard with the sun setting behind him, he realized he didn't want to let her go. I don't know how, he admitted. Clara smiled, soft and sad. No one does. You just try. Garrett named her Rose, not after anyone, just because it felt right. He sold the ranch and moved closer to town, took work at the mill, built a small house with a garden and a porch. Rose grew. She learned to walk, to talk, to laugh, a sound Garrett hadn't heard in his own home for years. Sometimes, late at night, he'd sit on the porch and think about the men in the canyon, about the choices he'd made, about the rifle he'd never hold again, and he'd think about his wife and the child they'd lost, and wonder if somehow this was the universe giving him a second chance he didn't deserve, but couldn't refuse. Years later, when Rose was 10, she asked him why he'd kept her. They were sitting by the fire, and she was holding a doll Clara had made, her face serious in the way only children can be. Garrett thought for a long time. Then he said, "Because you needed someone, and so did I." She nodded, like that made perfect sense. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and the sky stretched wide and endless above the little house. Garrett looked at Rose, at her dark eyes and stubborn chin, and the way she smiled like the world was hers to keep. And he knew, some things you don't choose, they choose you, and sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to choose them back. The last light of day spilled through the window, golden and warm, and Garrett Hale, once a lonely cowboy with nothing left to lose, sat beside his daughter and felt for the first time in years like he was home.